Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content and want to see more deep investigations like this one, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves true crime. Your support helps bring attention to cases that deserve to be told. Now let's begin. Phoenix, Arizona, May 17, 2001. The desert sun blazed over Paradise Valley High School as students poured out of classrooms, celebrating the last day of junior year. Summer stretched ahead like an endless promise. For 17-year-old Alyssa Turney, it should have been a day of freedom, of graduation parties and new beginnings. Instead, it became the day she vanished without a trace. This is the story of a girl who disappeared in broad daylight, a stepfather with dark secrets, a sister who refused to give up, and a case that would take nearly 20 years to reach a courtroom, only to end in a way no one expected. Alyssa Marie Turney was born on April 3, 1984, to Barbara Farner and Stephen Strong. When Alyssa was just 3 years old, her parents divorced. Her mother, Barbara, eventually married Michael Turney, a former electrician and sheriff's deputy. Michael brought 3 children from his previous relationship into the marriage, and Barbara brought Alyssa and her older brother. Michael adopted both children. Soon after, Michael and Barbara had a daughter together, Sarah. For a brief time, the blended family of 6 children seemed complete. But tragedy struck when Alyssa was only 9 years old. Barbara died of kidney cancer, leaving Michael to raise all the children alone. By the time Alyssa turned 17, the older children had moved out. Only Alyssa and 12-year-old Sarah remained in the house on Bell Road and 34th Street, living under Michael Turney's increasingly watchful eye. Alyssa was, by all accounts, a typical teenager. She worked part-time at Jack in the Box. She had a boyfriend named Jonathan Lockman. She dreamed of freedom, of California, of getting away from the strict rules that governed her life at home. Her friends described her as spirited, rebellious in the way many teenagers are when they're testing the boundaries of independence. But those who knew her well also knew something else. They knew Alyssa was trapped. They knew she lived in fear. And they knew that her stepfather, Michael Turney, was not the protective parent he claimed to be. Michael Turney controlled every aspect of Alyssa's life. He installed surveillance cameras throughout the house, both inside and outside. Every phone in the home was equipped with recording devices that captured every conversation. He would drive to Alyssa's workplace at Jack in the Box and film her from his car, sometimes arriving an hour or 2 early to ensure she didn't leave with anyone. He made her sign bizarre contracts, parent-child agreements that attempted to dictate her every movement, every choice, every breath. When Alyssa's friends later spoke to investigators, they painted a picture far darker than mere strictness. They told stories of sexual abuse, of Alyssa confiding in them about incidents that made her terrified to be alone with her stepfather. One friend said Alyssa had described waking up bound and gagged, with Michael on top of her. Another said Alyssa told him that Michael had driven her out to the desert and assaulted her. And remarkably, a year before Alyssa disappeared, Michael had contacted Child Protective Services himself. He told them that if Alyssa ever came forward with allegations of abuse, she would be lying. It was a preemptive strike, an attempt to discredit his stepdaughter before she could speak. By the spring of 2001, Alyssa was counting down the days until she turned 18. She had talked about moving to California, where an aunt was willing to take her in. She had even written a driver's education essay calculating the time and distance it would take to drive there. In recorded phone calls, later released by investigators, Alyssa could be heard asking her boyfriend if his parents would let him go to California with her. She had told her older brother James that she wanted to come live with him. James, who was 10 years older than Alyssa, had seen the way Michael treated the girls after their mother died. He had wanted to take both Alyssa and Sarah in, sensing that something was terribly wrong. But he never got the chance. Because on May 17, 2001, Alyssa Turney disappeared. It was the last day of school. Sarah, then 12 years old, was on a field trip to a water park with her 7th grade class. Alyssa had plans to attend a graduation party that evening. According to Michael Turney, he picked Alyssa up from Paradise Valley High School around 11 in the morning. He said they went out to lunch together, just the two of them. During that lunch, Michael claims they got into an argument. Alyssa wanted more freedom. She wanted to stay out later with her friends. Michael told her that wasn't going to happen. Not under his roof. Not while she was under his control. He said the argument escalated. He said Alyssa became angry. After lunch, Michael claims he dropped Alyssa off at home around 1 in the afternoon. He then left to run errands and to pick up Sarah from her field trip. When Michael and Sarah returned home later that evening, Alyssa was gone. Her cell phone was still there. Her car was parked outside. Her makeup, her hairbrush, her house keys, all of it remained untouched. In her bank account sat $1,800, money she had been saving from her job. She never withdrew a single cent. But in her bedroom, Michael said he found a note. A handwritten note in Alyssa's own handwriting. The note said she was running away to California. She couldn't live there anymore. She was leaving and she wasn't coming back. Michael Turney reported Alyssa missing that night, calling the Phoenix Police Department to tell them his 17-year-old stepdaughter had run away. At the time, police saw no reason to suspect foul play. Alyssa was 17, just a few months shy of 18. She had no history of mental or physical health issues. There was a note in her own handwriting. Her friends and family confirmed she had been unhappy at home, that she had talked about wanting to leave. The police classified Alyssa as a runaway. They entered her information into the National Crime Information Center database, and then, for the most part, they moved on. Phoenix police handled thousands of runaway reports every year. Alyssa Turney was just another teenager who wanted to escape a strict household. Except she wasn't, because Alyssa never called anyone. She never contacted her friends. She never touched her money. She never showed up anywhere. She simply vanished, as if she had never existed at all. A week after Alyssa disappeared, Michael Turney told police he received a phone call. It was early in the morning, and the call came from a payphone in Riverside, California. Michael claimed the voice on the other end was Alyssa's. He said she was angry, that she cursed at him, told him to leave her alone, and then hung up. Police checked the location of the payphone. They found no evidence that Alyssa had been there. No witnesses, no security footage, nothing. The call, if it even happened, led nowhere. For the Turney family, life tried to move forward. Sarah, who had just finished 7th grade, believed her father's story. She thought Alyssa had run away. She thought her sister had chosen to leave them behind. It wasn't until years later, when Sarah was in her 20s, that she began to question everything she had been told. It wasn't until years later that she realized her father had been lying all along. The case went cold. For 5 years, nothing happened. Alyssa's name sat in a database, one missing teenager among thousands. Her case file gathered dust. Her friends and family moved on with their lives, though they never forgot her. And then, in 2006, something strange happened. A man named Thomas Albert Heimer, serving a life sentence in a Florida prison for murder, wrote a letter to a prison guard. In that letter, Heimer confessed to killing Alyssa Turney. He claimed he was a serial killer, that he had murdered multiple victims, and that Alyssa was one of them. When Phoenix police received the confession, they began to investigate. They interviewed Heimer, trying to determine if his story was legitimate. But as they dug deeper, inconsistencies emerged. Heimer's description of Alyssa didn't match reality. The details he provided were wrong. When pressed, Heimer admitted he might have been mistaken. He might have confused Alyssa with a different victim. The confession was a hoax, nothing more than the fantasy of a man seeking notoriety from behind bars. But Heimer's false confession had an unintended consequence. It forced Phoenix police to take a closer look at Alyssa's case. And when they did, they realized something they should have seen from the very beginning. Alyssa Turney had not run away. Alyssa Turney had been murdered. In 2008, the Phoenix Police Department Missing Persons Unit officially reopened Alyssa's case. Detectives Stuart Summers-Ho and William Anderson were assigned to lead the investigation. They began by interviewing everyone who had known Alyssa, her friends, her boyfriend, her teachers, her co-workers at Jack in the Box. And as they spoke to these people, a disturbing pattern emerged. Nearly everyone pointed to the same person, Michael Turney. Alyssa's friends told detectives about the abuse. They told them about the surveillance, the control, the fear that Alyssa had lived with every single day. Her boyfriend, Jonathan Lockman, confirmed that Alyssa had confided in him about her stepfather's behavior. He said she was terrified of Michael, that she had told him things that made him deeply uncomfortable. When detectives examined the evidence more closely, they found inconsistencies in Michael's story. The note Alyssa supposedly left behind, while written in her handwriting, seemed off. Runaway teenagers don't typically leave notes. They leave in secret, not wanting to be found. And if they do leave notes, they don't usually leave behind all their money, their belongings, their phone. Everything about Alyssa's disappearance suggested she hadn't left voluntarily. Everything suggested something terrible had happened to her in that house on the last day she was seen alive. In December 2008, 7 years after Alyssa disappeared, Phoenix police executed a search warrant at Michael Turney's home. What they found inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. The house was filled with evidence of Michael's obsession. There were dozens of videotapes, some dating back to the 1980s, showing surveillance footage from around the property. Michael had been recording his family for decades, but notably, there was no footage from May 17, 2001, the day Alyssa disappeared. The tapes from that day were missing, but the videos weren't the most shocking discovery. In the garage and throughout the property, police found an arsenal that suggested Michael Turney was preparing for war. 19 high-caliber assault rifles, 2 homemade silencers, a van filled with gasoline cans, and 26 pipe bombs, improvised explosive devices filled with gunpowder and roofing nails, designed to cause maximum carnage. Police also discovered a manifesto, 98 pages long. The document was titled Diary of a Madman Martyr. In it, Michael laid out a conspiracy theory. He believed that the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, a union he had once been affiliated with during his time as an electrician, was responsible for Alyssa's disappearance. He wrote that the union had hired assassins to kidnap and murder Alyssa, and that they had buried her body in Desert Center, California. He claimed he had already killed 2 of these so-called assassins in self-defense. And he detailed a plan to attack the union's headquarters in Phoenix on December 15, 2008, during a scheduled meeting. He planned to set off explosives, kill as many people as possible, and then take his own life. Michael Turney was arrested on December 11, 2008, just 4 days before his planned attack. He was charged with possession of unregistered explosives and weapons. In March 2010, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to the maximum term of 10 years in federal prison. While Michael Turney sat behind bars, Sarah Turney was growing up. She had spent most of her life believing her father's story, believing that Alyssa had simply run away. But as she got older, doubts began to creep in. Michael's story kept changing. First, he said he had dropped Alyssa off at home after lunch. Then he said they had argued. Then he said he had received a phone call from her. The details never quite lined up. And the more Sarah learned about her sister's case, the more she realized that something was very, very wrong. In 2017, Michael Turney was released from federal prison. He had served his sentence for the weapons charges, but no charges had been filed in connection with Alyssa's disappearance. Legally, he was a free man. Sarah, now in her late 20s, couldn't accept that. She couldn't accept that her father was walking free while Alyssa's case remained unsolved. So Sarah decided to do something about it. In June 2019, Sarah Turney launched a podcast called Voices for Justice. In the podcast, she told Alyssa's story in meticulous detail, drawing on over 3,000 pages of publicly released police documents. She interviewed friends, family members, and anyone who had known Alyssa. She laid out the evidence against her father piece by piece, building a case in the court of public opinion that prosecutors had failed to build in a court of law. The podcast gained a following, but it wasn't enough. Sarah needed a bigger platform. She needed to reach more people. She needed to force the authorities to act. And then, in April 2020, During the early days of the global pandemic, Sarah discovered TikTok. At first, she joined the app as a distraction, something to pass the time while the world was locked down. But she quickly realized that TikTok could be something more, could be Alyssa's opportunity. Sarah began posting videos about her sister's case. She posted clips from Michael's surveillance videos, showing him filming Alyssa at work. She posted recordings of phone calls. She posted interviews and case documents. She used popular sounds and trends on the platform to make the content engaging, to make people stop scrolling and pay attention. And it worked. Within weeks, Sarah's videos had been viewed millions of times. She gained hundreds of thousands of followers. People who had never heard of Alyssa Turney before were now demanding justice for her. The hashtag Justice for Alyssa began trending. Comments poured in, urging Phoenix police to reopen the investigation, to arrest Michael Turney, to do something, anything, to bring Alyssa home. The pressure worked. On August 19, 2020, nearly 2 decades after Alyssa disappeared, a Maricopa County grand jury indicted Michael Roy Turney on a charge of second-degree murder. Police arrested the 72-year-old man in Mesa, Arizona. When Sarah heard the news, she broke down. She posted a video on social media, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she said. "After almost 20 years, we did it. Never give up hope that you can get justice." Michael Turney made his first court appearance the following day. A judge denied his request for a reduction in bond. He would remain in jail until his trial. For Sarah, it felt like vindication. It felt like all the years of fighting, of advocating, of refusing to let Alyssa's case be forgotten, had finally paid off. But the battle was far from over, because proving Michael Turney's guilt in a court of law would be far more difficult than gaining public attention on social media. Michael Turney's trial began in July 2023, nearly 3 years after his arrest. The case drew significant media attention. Dateline, 2020, and countless other true crime programs covered the story. The courtroom in Maricopa County was packed with journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and members of the Turney family. Sarah Turney took the stand early in the trial. Her testimony was emotional and powerful. She described the years of surveillance, the control, the fear that had permeated their household. She told the jury about asking her father what had happened to Alyssa, and she recounted his chilling response. He told her he would tell her on his deathbed. Not now. Not when she needed to know. Only when he was ready to die. The prosecution built their case around circumstantial evidence. They presented testimony from Alyssa's friends, who spoke about the abuse they believed she had suffered. They called Detectives Stuart Summershoe and William Anderson to the stand, who walked the jury through the investigation and the inconsistencies in Michael's story. They pointed out that Alyssa had left behind everything she owned. Her money, her phone, her car, her entire life. They argued that no teenager planning to run away would do that. They argued that Michael Turney was the last person to see Alyssa alive, and that his behavior both before and after her disappearance suggested he was guilty of her murder. But the defense had a powerful counterargument. There was no body. There was no crime scene. There was no physical evidence linking Michael Turney to Alyssa's death. In fact, there was no evidence that Alyssa was even dead. Yes, she had disappeared. Yes, the circumstances were suspicious. But without a body, without forensic evidence, without a confession, how could the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael Turney had committed murder? After the state rested its case on July 17, 2023, Michael Turney's defense attorneys, Jamie Jackson and Olivia Hicks, filed a motion for acquittal under Rule 20 of the Arizona Rules of Criminal Procedure. The rule states that a court must enter a judgment of acquittal if there is no substantial evidence to support a conviction. The defense argued that the prosecution had failed to meet that standard. They argued that the state had presented no physical evidence that Alyssa was dead, and no evidence that Michael Turney had caused her death. They argued that circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, was not enough. The judge agreed. On July 18, 2023, Judge Halterman granted the defense's motion for acquittal. All charges against Michael Roy Turney were dismissed. He was released from custody immediately, having spent 3 years in jail awaiting trial. In the courtroom, Sarah Turney was devastated. She had fought for years to see this day, to see her father held accountable for what she believed he had done to her sister. And now, in an instant, it was over. Michael Turney walked out of the courtroom a free man. Outside, he spoke briefly to reporters. He maintained his innocence, as he had throughout the entire ordeal. He said he would never stop searching for his daughter. But to Sarah and many others who had followed the case, those words rang hollow. The legal system had failed Alyssa Turney. The state of Arizona cannot bring homicide charges against Michael Turney again. Double jeopardy protections prevent him from being tried for the same crime twice. Even if new evidence were to emerge, even if Alyssa's body were to be found, Michael Turney cannot be prosecuted for her murder. The only legal recourse left is a civil lawsuit, a wrongful death action that would hold Michael financially responsible rather than criminally. But even that would require a lower burden of proof, and it would not bring the justice that Sarah and so many others had hoped for. So where does that leave us? Alyssa Turney is still missing. She has been missing for over 23 years. Her case remains open. Phoenix police continue to investigate, occasionally revisiting sites in the Arizona desert where remains have been discovered, hoping one day to find evidence that will bring Alyssa home. But as time passes, the likelihood of that happening grows slimmer. Michael Turney, now 76 years old, remains free. He has never been convicted of any crime related to Alyssa's disappearance. In the eyes of the law, he is innocent. And yet, in the eyes of Sarah Turney and countless others who have followed this case, the truth is clear. Alyssa did not run away. Alyssa was murdered, and Michael Turney is responsible. This case raises difficult questions about our justice system. What happens when everyone believes a person is guilty, but the evidence isn't enough to convict? What happens when circumstantial evidence tells a compelling story, but there's no physical proof to back it up? What happens when a victim's family fights for decades to see justice, only to watch the accused walk free? These are questions without easy answers. The law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and in Alyssa's case, that standard was not met. But for Sarah Turney, the fight is not over. She continues to advocate for her sister, posting on social media, speaking to journalists, keeping Alyssa's name alive. She continues to call for changes in how missing persons cases are handled, particularly cases involving young people who disappear under suspicious circumstances. She has become a voice not just for Alyssa, but for countless other victims whose cases have been ignored or mishandled. Sarah's work has had an impact beyond her sister's case. Her podcast, Voices for Justice, has covered dozens of other missing persons cases, bringing attention to stories that might otherwise have been forgotten. She has shown that social media can be a powerful tool for advocacy, that a determined person with a platform can force authorities to take action. And while the outcome in Alyssa's case was not what Sarah hoped for, her efforts were not in vain. She got her sister's case reopened. She got her father arrested and charged. She ensured that Alyssa's story would not be forgotten. That is no small thing. The Alyssa Turney case is a reminder that not every story has a satisfying ending. Not every case gets solved. Not every victim gets justice. But it's also a reminder that we should never stop fighting. We should never stop asking questions. We should never stop demanding answers. Because somewhere out there, in the desert outside Phoenix, or in a place we may never find, Alyssa Turney is waiting. She is waiting for someone to bring her home. She is waiting for the truth to finally come to light. And until that day comes, her sister Sarah will continue to be her voice. If you have any information about the disappearance of Alyssa Turney, please contact the Phoenix Police Department Missing Persons Unit. Alyssa was 17 years old when she disappeared on May 17, 2001. She was last seen in Phoenix, Arizona, in the area of Bell Road and 34th Street. She is described as a white female with brown hair and brown eyes. Any information, no matter how small, could be the key to finally solving this case. Don't let Alyssa be forgotten. Be a voice for her. Thank you for listening to this case. If you found this story important, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth true crime investigations. These stories matter. These victims matter. And together, we can keep their memories alive. Until next time, stay safe and never stop seeking the truth. Story 2. Before we begin tonight's story, if you're finding value in these deep investigations into true crime cases, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone who appreciates stories about justice and injustice. Your support helps bring attention to cases that need to be told. Now let's begin. Clinton, Ontario, Canada, June 9th, 1959. The summer sun hung high over Royal Canadian Air Force Station Clinton, a military base about 180 kilometers west of Toronto. Children ran through the streets of the base housing, celebrating the start of summer vacation. It was a Tuesday evening, warm and muggy, the kind of night when everyone in the small community stayed outside as long as possible. For 12-year-old Lynn Harper, it should have been just another carefree summer evening. Instead, it became the night she disappeared. 2 days later, searchers would find her body in a nearby woodlot, raped and strangled. Within days, police would arrest 14-year-old Stephen Truscott, one of Lynn's classmates, and charge him with her murder. What followed was one of the most controversial wrongful conviction cases in Canadian history. A case built on flawed forensic science, unreliable witness testimony, and a justice system that sent a child to death row. A case that would take nearly 50 years to overturn. This is the story of Lynn Harper, Stephen Truscott, and a murder that shattered two families and changed Canadian law forever. Cheryl Lynn Harper was born on August 31st, 1946, in New Brunswick, Canada. She was the middle child of three, with an older brother Barry and a younger brother Jeffrey. Her father, Leslie Harper, had been a schoolteacher before joining the military in 1940. By the time Lynn was 10 years old, the Harper family had relocated to RCAF Station Clinton in July 1957. The base was a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else. Military families lived in permanent married quarters. Their children attended the Air Vice Marshal Hugh Campbell School located on the north side of the base, and life revolved around the rhythms of military service. Lynn was a typical 12-year-old girl. She attended Sunday school and Bible class. She was a member of the Girl Guides. She had friends on the base and enjoyed spending time outdoors. Her parents were protective, as most parents were in that era, but Lynn had the freedom that came with growing up in a small, safe community where neighbors looked out for one another. Or so everyone thought. Stephen Murray Truscott was born on January 18, 1945, making him 14 years old in the summer of 1959. He was a popular, athletic teenager, well-liked by his peers. His father was a warrant officer stationed at the base, and the Truscott family lived in the married quarters just like the Harpers. Stephen and Lynn were classmates in a combined grade 7 and 8 class at the base school. They knew each other the way all children in a small community know one another, but they were not particularly close friends. Stephen had his own circle of friends, kids he played with near the Bayfield River Bridge, kids he rode bikes with through the county roads surrounding the base. On June 9, 1959, Stephen Truscott's life changed forever. It was the day Lynn Harper asked him for a ride on his bicycle, and it was the day that would eventually put him on death row. The evening of June 9th began like any other. Lynn Harper had been at home with her family. Around 7 in the evening, she told her parents she was going to visit a friend. She left the house wearing a white blouse with a floral pattern, blue jeans, and white and brown saddle shoes. She carried nothing with her. No purse, no money, no identification. She was simply a girl going out for an evening with friends, expecting to be home before dark. At approximately 7:10, Lynn encountered Stephen Truscott near the school grounds. According to Stephen, Lynn asked him if he would give her a ride on his bicycle to Highway 8, about a kilometer north of the school. Stephen agreed. He had Lynn sit on the crossbar of his bicycle, a common practice among kids in those days, and he began pedaling north along the county road toward the highway. Several witnesses saw them together that evening. Children playing near the road, families outside their homes. People noticed the two teenagers riding north on Stephen's bicycle. The timing of their encounter and what happened next would become the most contentious issues in one of Canada's most infamous criminal cases. Stephen Truscott maintained, from that evening forward and for the rest of his life, that he took Lynn to the intersection of the County Road and Highway 8. He said he left her there, unharmed, standing by the side of the road. Stephen claimed that as he rode back toward the base, he stopped on the Bayfield River Bridge and looked back toward the intersection. From that vantage point, he said, he saw a vehicle stop near where he had left Lynn. He saw her get into the car. It was a late model Chevrolet, possibly a Bel Air, with a lot of chrome and what appeared to be a yellow license plate. Stephen watched the car drive away with Lynn inside. He then continued back to the base, where he spent the rest of the evening with other children, playing and swimming until well after 8 o'clock. That was Stephen Truscott's story, and for nearly 50 years, almost no one believed him. Lynn Harper did not come home that night. When darkness fell and she still had not returned, her father, Leslie Harper, became worried. At 11:20 that evening, he reported his daughter missing to the base military police. A search began immediately. Military personnel, Ontario provincial police officers, local volunteers, everyone who could help joined the search. They scoured the base, the surrounding fields, the roads leading away from the community. For 2 days, they found nothing. And then, on the afternoon of June 11th, 1959, at 1:50 in the afternoon, searchers discovered Lynn Harper's body in a wooded area known as Lawson's Bush. The woodlet was located on a farm northeast of Clinton, accessible by a tractor trail that led off the county road. Lynn's body was lying in a small clearing, partially hidden by underbrush. She had been raped. Her own blouse had been used to strangle her. The scene was horrific, a nightmare that would haunt everyone who saw it. And within hours, police began to focus their investigation on the last person known to have seen Lynn alive, Stephen Truscott. On June 10th, the day before Lynn's body was found, police interviewed Stephen at his school. He was cooperative, telling them about giving Lynn a ride to the highway, about seeing her get into a car. At that point, Stephen was simply a witness, a boy who might have information about where Lynn had gone. But once her body was discovered, the tone of the investigation changed. Police began to see inconsistencies in Stephen's statements. They began to believe he was lying. On June 12, 1959, shortly after 7 in the evening, police took Stephen into custody. At 2:30 in the morning on June 13th, he was charged with murder under the provisions of the Juvenile Delinquents Act. Stephen Truscott, 14 years old, was accused of raping and murdering his 12-year-old classmate. The news sent shockwaves through the base and the surrounding community. How could a child commit such a crime? How could a boy everyone knew, a boy from a good military family, be capable of something so monstrous? But the police were convinced. And as the case moved forward, it became clear that the justice system was not interested in considering alternative possibilities. They had their suspect, and they were determined to convict him. On June 30th, 1959, a court ordered that Stephen Truscott be tried as an adult. This meant he would face trial in adult court, subject to adult sentencing. If convicted, he could receive the death penalty. An appeal of that order was dismissed. Stephen's fate was sealed. He would stand trial for capital murder. His trial began on September 16, 1959, in the Supreme Court of Ontario in Goderich. Stephen was represented by defense attorney Frank Donnelly. Glenn Hayes appeared for the Crown. The trial lasted just 15 days. It was a swift proceeding, driven by a prosecution that believed it had an airtight case and a defense that struggled to counter the weight of the evidence against their young client. The Crown's case rested on what prosecutors called 4 pillars. First, the time of death. Second, witness testimony placing Stephen with Lynn during the crucial time period. Third, Stephen's behavior after Lynn's disappearance, which the Crown argued demonstrated a guilty conscience. And fourth, physical evidence on Stephen's body that the Crown claimed proved he had sexually assaulted Lynn Harper. The most critical piece of evidence was the time of death. Dr. John Penistan, the pathologist who performed Lynn's autopsy, testified that based on the state of partially digested food found in her stomach, Lynn had died between 7 and 7:45 on the evening of June 9th. This narrow window was devastating for Stephen Truscott. Multiple witnesses had seen him with Lynn during that exact time period. If Dr. Penistan was correct, and Lynn died between 7 and 7:45, then Stephen Truscott was the only person who could have killed her. He was with her during those critical minutes. He admitted as much. His defense was that he left her alive at the highway, but if she died before 8 o'clock, there would not have been enough time for her to be picked up by a stranger, driven back past the bridge, taken down the tractor trail to Lawson's Bush, assaulted, and murdered. The timeline made it nearly impossible for anyone other than Stephen to be the killer, and Dr. Penistan's testimony sealed that timeline with what appeared to be scientific certainty. The Crown called 60 witnesses during the trial. Many were children, kids who had been playing near the county road and the bridge on the evening of June 9th. Their testimony was crucial to establishing when Stephen and Lynn had been seen together, when Stephen had returned to the base alone, and whether his account of events was credible. One witness was Jocelyn Gadet, a 13-year-old girl who testified that Stephen had arranged to meet her in the woods that evening. The Crown used her testimony to argue that Stephen had sexual intentions, that he had tried to lure Gadet into the woods, and when that failed, he set his sights on Lynn Harper instead. Another key witness was Arnold George, also 13, who testified that Stephen had asked him to lie to police about seeing him on the bridge. George's testimony suggested Stephen was trying to fabricate an alibi, further evidence of guilt. The defense called 14 witnesses, including children who corroborated parts of Stephen's story and an internal medicine specialist who challenged the reliability of Dr. Penistan's conclusions about time of death. But the defense faced an uphill battle. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The timeline seemed airtight, and Stephen Truscott, in what would later be seen as a critical mistake, did not testify in his own defense. On September 30th, 1959, after deliberating, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. They added a recommendation for mercy, a plea that reflected the discomfort many felt at the idea of sentencing a 14-year-old boy to death. But under Canadian law at the time, the judge had no discretion. The criminal code required that a conviction for capital murder carry a mandatory death sentence. Justice Ferguson sentenced Stephen Truscott to death by hanging. He would be executed at a date to be determined. The courtroom erupted. Stephen's mother, Doris Truscott, broke down in tears. Stephen himself, just 14 years old, stood in the prisoner's box, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He had been convicted of a crime he insisted he did not commit, and now he was going to die for it. Stephen Truscott became the youngest person in Canadian history to be sentenced to death. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Across Canada, people were horrified at the thought of executing a child. Newspapers ran editorials questioning the verdict. Citizens wrote letters to their members of Parliament, demanding that something be done. Stephen's lawyers filed an appeal to the Ontario Court of Appeal, arguing that the conviction was unsafe and that errors had been made during the trial. On January 21st, 1960, the Court of Appeal unanimously dismissed Stephen's appeal. But on the same day, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances, the federal government commuted Stephen's death sentence to life imprisonment. Stephen Truscott would not hang, but he would spend the rest of his life in prison unless something changed. He applied for leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, but on February 24, 1960, that application was also denied. At that point, Stephen had exhausted all legal options. He was transferred to various institutions, from the Huron County Jail in Goderich to Kingston Penitentiary, to the Ontario Training School for Boys in Guelph, and eventually to Collins Bay Penitentiary. He was a convicted murderer, a child rapist, the worst kind of criminal, and he was locked away from the world, left to serve his sentence while insisting, always, that he was innocent. For several years, Stephen Truscott's case faded from public attention. He was just another prisoner, another name in the system. But in 1966, everything changed. Author Isabelle Lebedet published a book titled The Trial of Stephen Truscott. In it, Lebedev presented a detailed argument that Stephen had been wrongfully convicted. She was highly critical of the police investigation, pointing out that other suspects had been ignored, that witness statements had been obtained improperly, and that the prosecution had built its case on questionable science and circumstantial evidence. Lebedev was particularly critical of Dr. Peniston's use of stomach contents to determine time of death, a method she argued was unreliable and prone to significant error. The book caused a sensation. It reignited public debate about the case and put enormous pressure on the government to take action. In April 1966, the Government of Canada referred the Truscott case to the Supreme Court of Canada, asking the court to review the conviction and determine whether a miscarriage of justice had occurred. For the first time, Stephen Truscott would have the opportunity to testify on his own behalf. The Supreme Court hearing took place in October 1966, with additional submissions heard in January 1967. Stephen testified before the court, telling his story in his own words. He maintained his innocence, explaining in detail what had happened on the evening of June 9, 1959. He described giving Lynn a ride to the highway, watching her get into a car, and returning to the base. He insisted he had never harmed her. 25 other witnesses also testified, some supporting Stephen's account, others casting doubt on it. When the Supreme Court finally delivered its decision, the result was devastating. By a vote of 8-1, the court ruled against Stephen Truscott. The majority opinion stated that the jury's original verdict was reasonable, that the evidence supported the finding of guilt, and that no miscarriage of justice had occurred. The court was particularly harsh in its assessment of Stephen's testimony. The justices wrote that there were many incredibilities inherent in the evidence given by Truscott and that they did not believe his testimony. The only dissenting voice was Justice Emmett Hall, who wrote a strong dissent arguing that the trial had not been conducted according to law and that Stephen deserved a new trial. But Hall's was a lone voice. Stephen Truscott remained a convicted murderer. The Supreme Court's decision shattered any remaining hope. If the highest court in Canada had reviewed the case and upheld the conviction, what chance did Stephen have? He returned to prison, resigned to the idea that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But then, on October 21, 1969, at the age of 24, Stephen Truscott was released on parole. He moved to Kingston, then briefly to Vancouver, before settling in Guelph, Ontario, under an assumed name. He married a woman named Marlene. They had 3 children together. Stephen worked, paid his taxes, lived a quiet life. To his neighbors, he was just another ordinary man. They had no idea he was a convicted murderer on parole. They had no idea that every day, Stephen lived with the weight of a crime he insisted he not commit. On November 12, 1974, Stephen was relieved of the terms and conditions of his parole by the National Parole Board. He was no longer under supervision, but he was still a convicted killer. That label would follow him for the rest of his life unless he could somehow clear his name. For decades, Stephen Truscott maintained a low profile. He did not seek publicity. He did not campaign for his innocence. He simply lived his life, raising his children, supporting his family, trying to move forward. But in 2000, everything changed again. The CBC television program, The Fifth Estate, aired an investigative documentary about Stephen's case. The program featured an interview with Stephen, his first public appearance in decades. For the first time, Canadians heard Stephen Truscott speak in his own words about what had happened to him. The documentary also raised disturbing questions about the investigation. It pointed out that other suspects had been ignored. In particular, it focused attention on a man named Alexander Kalachuk, a Royal Canadian Air Force sergeant with a history of sexual offenses. Just 3 weeks before Lynn Harper was murdered, Kalachuk had been arrested in St. Thomas, Ontario, for attempting to lure a young girl into his car. The charge was dismissed, but he was given a warning by the judge. On the same day Lynn disappeared, June 9, 1959, Air Force medical officers held a discussion about Kalachuk's drinking and behavior. Around the same time, his probation officer advised Air Force officials about another incident of indecent exposure involving Kalachuk in the town of Seaforth, not far from the Clinton base. Then, 3 weeks after Lynn's murder, On July 2nd, Kalachuk was hospitalized due to overwhelming anxiety, tension, depression, and guilt, as reported in RCAF documents. Despite all of this, police never seriously investigated Kalachuk as a suspect in Lynn Harper's murder. He remained at the periphery, a figure who might have been responsible but who was never properly scrutinized. Kalachuk eventually drank himself to death in 1975, spending his final days in a psychiatric hospital, incoherent and suffering from chronic alcoholism. The Fifth Estate documentary, combined with a subsequent book by journalist Julian Schur, brought Stephen Truscott's case back into the national spotlight. Public opinion began to shift. More and more Canadians came to believe that Stephen had been wrongfully convicted, that he was innocent, and that a terrible miscarriage of justice had occurred. In November 2001, James Lockyer, a prominent lawyer with the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, filed an appeal on Stephen's behalf. The appeal asked the federal government to reopen the case and review the conviction in light of new evidence. On January 24, 2002, the federal government appointed retired Quebec Justice Fred Kaufman to conduct an independent review. Kaufman was well respected, having previously presided over an inquiry into another wrongful conviction case, that of Guy Paul Morin. Kaufman's review took 19 months. He examined every piece of evidence, interviewed witnesses, consulted experts, and produced a comprehensive 4-volume, 700-page report. In October 2004, Justice Minister Erwin Cotelaer announced that he was referring Stephen Truscott's case back to the Ontario Court of Appeal. Cotelaer stated that he had determined there was a reasonable basis to conclude that a miscarriage of justice had occurred. The case would be reviewed again, this time with the benefit of new evidence and advances in forensic science that had not been available in 1959. On June 19, 2006, the Ontario Court of Appeal began hearing fresh evidence in Stephen Truscott's case. A 5-judge panel, headed by Ontario Chief Justice Roy McMurtry and including Justice Michael Moldaver, would hear 3 weeks of testimony. This was an extraordinary proceeding. The court would not simply review the existing record. It would hear new testimony, consider new evidence, and make a determination about whether Stephen's conviction should stand. For Stephen Truscott, now 61 years old, this was his last chance. If the Court of Appeal ruled against him, there would be no further appeals. His conviction would remain, and he would die branded as a murderer and rapist. The hearing was notable for several reasons. It was the first time that cameras were allowed into a criminal hearing at the Ontario Court of Appeal. Canadians could watch the proceedings live online, witnessing firsthand the presentation of evidence and the arguments made by both sides. It was a transparency unprecedented in Canadian legal history. The fresh evidence presented during the hearing systematically dismantled each of the 4 pillars of the Crown's original case. The first pillar, the time of death, was shown to be deeply flawed. Several medical experts testified that the science used by Dr. Penistan in 1959 was unreliable. Dr. Penistan had based his estimate of time of death primarily on the analysis of stomach contents, determining that Lynn had died between 7 and 7:45 because of the partially digested food found in her stomach during the autopsy. But by 2006, scientific understanding of gastric emptying had advanced significantly. Experts testified that the rate at which stomachs empty varies widely and depends on numerous factors, including age, gender, diet, stress level, and individual physiology. There was no way to pinpoint time of death to a 45-minute window based solely on stomach contents. In fact, using that method, Lynn could have died any time within a 12-hour period after her last meal. Even more damaging was the revelation that Dr. Penistan himself had doubted his own conclusions. In 1966, just before the Supreme Court review, Dr. Penistan had written a letter to the lead police investigator, Harold Graham. In that letter, he admitted he had made an agonizing reappraisal of his testimony and concluded that he should not have supplied such a narrow window of time. That letter had never been disclosed to Stephen's defense team. It had been hidden, buried in the files, kept secret for decades. The most critical piece of evidence used to convict Stephen Truscott was unreliable. and the pathologist who provided it had known it was unreliable. But there was more. The Court of Appeal also heard testimony from forensic entomologists, scientists who study insects and their life cycles to determine time of death. When Lynn's body was discovered on June 11, 1959, photographs had been taken at the scene and during the autopsy. Those photographs showed maggots and other insect activity on the body. In 1959, that evidence was noted but not used. Forensic entomology was in its infancy as a scientific discipline, and investigators did not understand its significance. But by 2006, the science had advanced dramatically. Forensic entomologists could now use insect evidence to estimate when a body had been colonized by flies, which in turn provided a more accurate estimate of time of death. 3 forensic entomologists testified at the 2006 hearing. Their testimony was controversial, with disagreements about the identification of insect species and the behavior of those species. But ultimately, the court accepted the testimony of 2 experts, Dr. Shara van Leerhoven and Dr. Richard Merritt. Based on their analysis and a recreation experiment conducted in the same woodlet where Lynn's body had been found, they concluded that initial fly colonization had occurred during daylight hours on June 10, 1959. In other words, Lynn Harper had not died on the evening of June 9th between 7 and 7:45. She had likely died much later, possibly not until the following day. If that was true, then Stephen Truscott could not have killed her. He had been with numerous witnesses after 8 o'clock on June 9th and throughout the following day. The time of death, the linchpin of the Crown's case, had collapsed. The second pillar, witness testimony, was also shown to be unreliable. Several witnesses who had testified at the original trial came forward decades later with new information. Jocelyn Gadet, the girl who had claimed Stephen arranged to meet her in the woods, was revealed to have possibly lied on the stand. 2 former nurses came forward in the early 2000s, stating that they had been in nursing school with Gadet in 1966. One of the nurses, Sandra Stolzman, testified that Gadet had told her one night, "They've got the wrong guy, they've got the wrong guy." According to Stolzman, Gadet said police should have been going after a man in a yellow car who had been seen in the area. Gadet had refused to come forward because she was afraid to admit she had lied at the original trial. Another witness, Karen Daum, now Karen Jutzi, testified that her original statement to police had been incorrect. She said she was shocked when she saw her signed statement years later because it did not reflect what she had actually seen. She testified that she had seen Stephen and Lynn on a road near Lawson's Bush after 7 in the evening, contradicting the Crown's timeline. And then there was Bob Lawson, the farmer who owned the property where Lynn's body was found. Lawson testified at the 2006 hearing that on the night Lynn disappeared, he had seen a strange car parked near his fence line. He had gone to the guardhouse at the base to report it, but the officer on duty was not interested. Lawson also testified that during the 1959 trial, Jocelyn Gadet had come to his farm and asked him to change his testimony to match hers. Lawson had refused. The witness testimony that had helped convict Stephen Truscott was riddled with problems, inconsistencies, and possible fabrications. The third pillar, Stephen's behavior after Lynn's disappearance, was re-examined. The Crown had argued that Stephen displayed a guilty conscience, that he had tried to create a false alibi, that he had acted suspiciously. But the fresh evidence showed that Stephen's behavior was consistent with that of an innocent teenager who had been caught up in a nightmare. He had cooperated with police. He had answered their questions. He had tried to help find Lynn. Yes, he had told police about seeing her get into a car, but he had not mentioned that detail immediately. But was that evidence of guilt? Or was it simply the behavior of a scared 14-year-old boy who didn't realize the significance of what he had seen until later? The Court of Appeal found that the Crown's interpretation of Stephen's behavior was not as damning as it had seemed in 1959. And the fourth pillar, the physical evidence on Stephen's body, was also challenged. At the time of his arrest, a doctor had observed abrasions on Stephen's penis. The Crown argued that these abrasions were caused by sexual intercourse with a young girl, specifically Lynn Harper. But experts testified at the 2006 hearing that the lesions could have been caused by many things and were most likely not the result of sexual intercourse. There was no scientific basis for the Crown's claim. One by one, the pillars that had supported Stephen Truscott's conviction crumbled. The time of death was wrong. The witness testimony was unreliable. His behavior was not evidence of guilt, and the physical evidence proved nothing. On January 31st, 2007, the Ontario Court of Appeal began hearing final arguments. Over the course of 10 days, lawyers for both sides presented their cases. Stephen Truscott, Marlis Edward, James Lockyer, Philip Campbell, Hirsch Wulch, and Jenny Friedland all argued passionately that Stephen's conviction was a miscarriage of justice and should be overturned. The Crown, for its part, acknowledged that problems existed with the original case but stopped short of conceding that Stephen should be acquitted. When the arguments concluded on February 10th, the court reserved its decision. For months, Stephen and his family waited. They had been through this before, the waiting, the hoping, the crushing disappointment. Stephen tried not to let himself believe that this time would be different. He had learned, over the course of nearly 5 decades, not to expect justice. And then, on August 28, 2007, the Ontario Court of Appeal delivered its decision. The 5-judge panel unanimously ruled to quash Stephen Truscott's conviction. In a detailed written judgment, the court concluded that the conviction was a miscarriage of justice that must be quashed. The court found that the fresh evidence, particularly regarding time of death, could reasonably be expected to have caused the jury to have at least a reasonable doubt that Lynn Harper died before 8 in the evening. Without that narrow time window, the Crown's case fell apart. The court ordered that Stephen Truscott be acquitted of the murder of Lynn Harper. Stephen Truscott was finally free. Not just free from prison, he had been released on parole in 1969, but free from the stigma of a murder conviction. He was no longer a convicted killer. He was an innocent man. Stephen's reaction was one of disbelief and relief. He told reporters he was just elated when he heard the news. He said he had never in his wildest dreams expected this to come true in his lifetime. It was a dream come true. Ontario Attorney General Michael Bryant apologized to Stephen on behalf of the provincial government, stating that they were truly sorry for the miscarriage of justice. Bryant also announced that the Crown would not appeal the decision. It was over. Stephen Truscott's defense team had originally asked for a declaration of factual innocence, which would mean that Stephen would be declared innocent beyond any doubt. But the court stopped short of that. Although they issued the acquittal, the court said it was not in a position to declare Stephen factually innocent. The court wrote that the appellant has not demonstrated his factual innocence, and at this time, and on the totality of the record, we are in no position to make a declaration of innocence. It was a distinction that mattered. An acquittal means the Crown failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. A declaration of innocence means the person definitively did not commit the crime. Stephen was acquitted, but he was not declared innocent. For some, that distinction left lingering doubt. But for Stephen and his supporters, the acquittal was enough. He had been vindicated. In 2008, the Ontario government awarded Stephen Truscott $6.5 million in compensation for the miscarriage of justice. It was a recognition that he had not only spent a decade in prison for a crime he did not commit, but had also spent nearly half a century stigmatized as a rapist and murderer. The compensation could never give Stephen back the years he had lost, the childhood stolen from him, the decades lived under a false conviction. But it was an acknowledgement, however inadequate, of the terrible wrong that had been done. Stephen used a portion of the compensation to establish the Truscott Initiative in Justice Studies at the University of Guelph, funding 2 scholarships for students in the field. He wanted to ensure that future generations would learn from his case, that the mistakes made in 1959 would not be repeated. Stephen Truscott continues to live in Guelph with his wife Marlene. He is now a grandfather. He rarely gives interviews and has lived under an assumed name for most of his adult life, seeking privacy and normalcy after decades of public scrutiny. For Stephen, the acquittal brought closure, but it did not bring an end to the pain. The years on death row, the decade in prison, the 47 years living as a convicted murderer, Those are scars that can never fully heal. But what about Lynn Harper? In all of this, it is important not to lose sight of the victim. Lynn Harper was a 12-year-old girl who was brutally raped and murdered. Her life was stolen from her on a summer evening in 1959. Her family, particularly her father Leslie Harper, never believed Stephen Truscott was innocent. To them, the acquittal was not justice. It was a denial of the truth. Leslie Harper maintained until his death that Stephen was guilty, that the evidence against him was overwhelming, and that the courts had made a terrible mistake in overturning the conviction. For the Harper family, there has been no closure. Lynn's murder remains officially unsolved. Stephen Truscott was acquitted, but no one else has ever been charged. Alexander Kalichuk, the Air Force sergeant who many believe could have been responsible, died in 1975. He was never formally investigated as a suspect. Other potential suspects, like Clayton Dennis, a convicted rapist who worked on the base, or Matthew Marone, a lifeguard who later sexually abused his own daughters, were never questioned by police. The investigation in 1959 was rushed and narrow, focused entirely on Stephen Truscott to the exclusion of all other possibilities. Because of that tunnel vision, the real killer, whoever he was never caught. Lynn Harper's murder will likely never be solved. The Stephen Truscott case had a profound impact on Canadian law and society. It became one of the most significant factors leading to the abolition of the death penalty in Canada. The image of a 14-year-old boy sentenced to hang horrified the nation and sparked a national conversation about capital punishment. Could a justice system that made such grievous errors be trusted with the power to execute its citizens? The answer for many Canadians was no.